I think Denver's okay in their front court. It's looking pretty nice. A guy named Nikola Jokic. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he's a pretty big deal. Single-handedly carried this team, Denver Nuggets. I mean, he gave them everything he had, man, the entire season. Props to him. He could be the 2021-22 MVP. We're still waiting on that announcement as of today. But in any case, great season for Denver when you consider the fact that they were missing two of their best three players, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr. Definitely hurts to not have them in the lineup. So that held them back from being, I would say, like a top 4 seed. But they still did pretty well. Looking at their overall season rankings here, Denver finished with a plus 2.1 point differential, so that put them 12th. And then they were top 10 in offense, and they were about average on defense. So if we're looking at the whole picture for this team, that's not a bad finish, honestly. And, for them, they finished with 48 wins. So I think that's a testament to Jokic's greatness. They couldn't do anything near that without him being a supernova presence in the front court at the center position. So that's very impressive. And then if we zoom out a little bit and we're looking at their salary situation, definitely near the tax. Denver ducked the tax just barely this past season or this current season by about 850,000. That's very, very close to the tax, and they just barely managed to stay under that. And for next season, it's going to remains to be seen if they're going to try to duck it again. Then we're definitely going to have to make some moves to make that happen. It's good at least that they were able to avoid the tax with them not being a real title contender. I think that's a pretty big accomplishment, especially with a guy like Jokic on such a massive contract. Looking at their other two players, Jamal Murray is in the midst of a max contract. And this is the part that hurt, man. Michael Porter Jr. signed that extension, that max extension, right there in the offseason. Barely got into the season. He gets hurt. He hurts his back. He's done the whole year. So, luckily it didn't kick in yet. That's next season. But it's just not a good sign when one of your franchise talents has an injury flare up again that it hurt him in college, and that actually dropped his draft stock quite a bit. You don't want to see that flare up again in the NBA because backs can be troublesome. And it sapped Dwight Howard of his athleticism when he was in Orlando towards the end of that tenure. And it's just scary for a team that invested so much money in him to see that flare up so early. So definitely a tough blow for Denver. But across the rest of the roster, I mean, they're looking good. Will Barton's still under contract. Aaron Gordon's under a contract for quite a bit. And Bones Highland has come out and shown out there at the backup guard spot. So a lot of things to like for Denver. And I think they're going to have a lot of depth going into next season, whether or not they decide to make some minor moves on the margins.
When you brought up Michael Porter Jr., I mean, that's someone that popped into mind when we were thinking about, is Zach LaVine worth a max contract? Because there's been guys before that maybe haven't played a lot of games or haven't really lived up to being a max contract player that have still gotten it because of necessity. Right? Denver really wanted to have Michael Porter Jr. They really believed in him. And maybe he can still be that kind of player because his talent, right, when he's on, I think in the bubble he really showed out, right? If everyone remembers that, there's times when he shows flashes of, okay, he's really a max contract level player, and then you look at his basketball reference page and you see that he's played 125 games since being drafted, and you're like, this is kind of a little bit alarming. Whether it's missing his whole rookie season, playing 9 games this year, he really just hasn't been able to find a way to get on the court, and that's obviously, right, such an important part of building a high level team is, right, not just having guys that are talented on your roster on paper, but obviously, right, guys that can actually be on the court and help this team win. And he hasn't done a lot of that. That's obviously got to be concerning for Denver, being that they put up so much of their cap space towards a guy like him. To not even see it on the court is pretty alarming. But there's a couple guys here, right, that this season will be unrestricted free agents. I'm looking at Austin Rivers. I'm looking at Bryn Forbes. Those are guys that, right, aren't jumping off the page. They're not really going to start for you or anything like that, but they're going to give you some solid minutes. They did this season. And Denver's got to think about what they're going to do with those guys, because if Michael Porter Jr. is not playing and Jamal Murray, right, hopefully next year he's coming back and he's able to recover from his injury properly, you're still going to need a solid bench there to make up for some of that lack of, right, really consistent guard play or small forward play. So hopefully they're able to re-sign those guys because they're on some pretty small contracts and they can still maneuver being under the tax, like you said. But to really make this work, they might have to go over the tax, and we'll see if that's something they're able to do well, and in a smart, strategic way to really make sure that they're putting together a team that's actually really competitive.
And they're going to have to be a little more strategic in how they go about building this roster from here on out, because now you have 3 max contracts on this team as of next season. So now you're looking at Jokic, Murray, and Porter Jr. all making north of $30 million. So that definitely puts the clamps on your books a little bit. And you go out to next season, you look at their space. I mean, there is no space. There's no more ducking the tax. That I think that's why they made it a point to do it this season, because there's such a thing called as the repeater tax. Once you're paying that tax, multiple years, once you get out 2 and 3 years of paying that, and then the penalties get more and more extreme. And they saw that in the distance, and they said to themselves, "Let's go ahead and duck the tax this year while we still can, before Porter gets into that $30 million range and just hamstrings their books for the foreseeable future." That's talking about the max salaries. Just look at the small salaries. I mean, I see DeMarcus Cousins on their books. It was the rest of the season contract, so he only made about 430,000 for them. At least that was on their books, and he's unrestricted. That he played pretty well in the playoffs, and he had a pretty solid season, I think, low key for Denver. So maybe they go about re-signing him to a nice little vet minimum and bringing him back for next season. That's a move I would think about making if I'm Denver and I wanted to kind of fortify my back end depth. You can never be too sure with who you have behind Jokic. Sometimes it seems like it's not necessary, but as the playoffs have shown, it's never a bad thing to have too much depth. So Cousins is a name I'm looking at as a guy that might be brought back, because I think he's earned another deal with this team because of how well he played behind Jokic when Jokic was banged up or he was in foul trouble or he missed a game for whatever reason.
Definitely, and that's another guy, right? Coming back from a pretty devastating injury, right? But I mean, a couple of these guys on Denver have those issues, but he's been able to come back pretty well and obviously still give really good minutes when needed. And that's something, right, that every team at that level, you can get a contract like that, is important. So for Denver, it's going to be important to really fill their bench with guys that they can actually play and that they can actually give them good minutes when they really need it. Another team's, when thinking about